What if the people sworn to protect you became the ones you feared the most? Marcus Reynolds had spent decades serving his country, fighting for justice, for freedom. But on a quiet Saturday morning in his own hometown, he found himself facing an enemy he never expected, one wearing a badge. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dewy grass and fresh earth. Marcus J. Reynolds inhaled deeply, letting the coolness settle in his lungs before exhaling slowly. His sneakers hit the pavement in a steady rhythm, each step firm, measured. A routine, a habit, a piece of normalcy in a life that had seen too much chaos. At 61, Marcus was still in remarkable shape. Decades of discipline had carved him into the man he was. Broad shoulders, sharp reflexes, and a presence that demanded respect. People in the neighborhood knew him, admired him, respected him. He wasn't just a retired veteran. He was a symbol. As he rounded the last block toward home, sweat clinging to his skin, he caught the familiar scent of coffee and griddled bacon. Saturday, diner morning. His stomach agreed, rumbling low as he changed course toward the small corner cafe he had visited every Saturday for years. Inside, the smell of sizzling eggs and buttered toast greeted him. Warm, familiar, home. He nodded at the owner, an older woman with graying hair tied in a bun. "Morning, Miss Ellen." She beamed. "Morning, Marcus. Usual?" "You know it." Sliding into his usual booth, Marcus let out a slow breath, enjoying the simple pleasure of routine. Predictability was a gift, one he had learned to cherish. Then he felt it. A gaze, heavy, unmoving. Marcus didn't react immediately, but he noticed. He always noticed. Across the counter, a man sat stiffly, fingers wrapped around a coffee mug. His uniform was crisp, badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Officer Brian Carter. Marcus knew that look. The calculated stare, the quiet judgment, the silent assumption. Still, he ignored it. This was his morning. He wasn't about to let a stranger ruin it. His plate arrived, steaming eggs and buttered toast sitting neatly beside crispy bacon. He reached for the fork, but the sensation of being watched lingered. Carter took a slow sip from his coffee, gaze unwavering. Marcus exhaled through his nose. This was nothing, right? Just another cop in a diner. So why did it feel like something else? He forced himself to focus on breakfast. Ignore it. Move on. But deep down, he already knew. This morning wouldn't stay routine for long. Marcus stepped out of the diner, stretching his arms as the morning sun warmed his skin. A good meal, a familiar place, a routine, but something felt different. Office. He could still feel Carter's stare, even though the officer hadn't said a word. It wasn't the casual glance of a stranger. It was something else. Pushing the thought aside, Marcus walked to his car, an old but well-maintained black Chevy Silverado. Reliable, sturdy, just like him. Sliding into the driver's seat, he took one last sip of his coffee before placing it in the holder. Time to head home. He barely made it 2 blocks before the flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. Red and blue. Spinning. Demanding. Marcus sighed. "Here we go," he signaled, pulled over to the curb, and placed both hands on the steering wheel. A habit drilled into him over years of knowing how these situations could go. A car door slammed, heavy boots crunched against pavement. Then, a voice, sharp, unfriendly. "License and registration." Marcus turned his head. Carter. His posture, his tone, the way his hand hovered near his holster. It wasn't just a traffic stop, it was something else. Marcus didn't argue. He reached slowly into the glove compartment, retrieving his registration. Then from his wallet, his driver's license. Calm, composed, unshaken. Carter snatched them from his hands, barely looking at them. "You in a hurry?" Marcus held his gaze. "No." Carter took a step back, scanning the car as if searching for something, or inventing something. "This your vehicle?" Marcus kept his voice even. "It is," Carter smirked, glancing over the paperwork in his hands. He wasn't running the plates. He wasn't checking the registration. He was stalling. A second squad car pulled up. Another officer stepped out. Reinforcements. Marcus exhaled slowly. This was about control, about power, about making a point. The second officer lingered near the patrol car, arms crossed, watching, waiting. Marcus had been here before. He knew the game. Carter leaned in slightly. "Got anything in the car I should know about?" "No." Carter's smirk widened. "Mind if I take a look?" Marcus's jaw tightened. Now came the real test. He took a steady breath before answering. "Unless you have probable cause, that's not happening." Carter's expression flickered, just for a second. Then he let out a dry chuckle. "Probable cause," he repeated, shaking his head. "Man, you act like you got something to hide." The second officer shifted, taking a step closer. The pressure was building. Marcus stayed calm, eyes locked on Carter's. "I know my rights," Carter grinned. "Let's find out how much they really mean." Marcus knew that tone. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. This wasn't just a stop anymore. This was a setup, and he wasn't about to walk into it blindly. Marcus kept his hands on the steering wheel, his posture relaxed but his mind alert. He knew what was coming. Carter took a step back, his smirk widening. "You know, we got a call earlier about a stolen vehicle. Black pickup truck. Matches this one exactly." Marcus didn't even blink. There it was, the setup. "If that's the case," Marcus said calmly, "run the plates." Carter chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, we'll get to that. But first, step out of the vehicle." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Stay calm. Stay in control. Officer, if you think my vehicle is stolen, confirming that information should be your first step," Marcus said, his voice measured. Carter's smirk faded. He didn't like being challenged. "I don't take orders," he snapped. "Now step out." Marcus glanced toward the second officer, who stood by the patrol car, arms still crossed. Silent but present. A small crowd had started to gather on the sidewalk. Bystanders, witnesses, cameras. Marcus spotted at least 2 people recording. Good. He unbuckled his seatbelt but stayed seated. "Run the plates," he repeated. Carter let out a sharp breath, shaking his head as if Marcus was being difficult. Theatrics. He wanted control. "You're stalling," Carter muttered. "Maybe you don't want me looking inside because you got something in there." Marcus narrowed his eyes. Here it was. The next move. "I already told you there's nothing illegal in my truck," he said. Carter folded his arms. "Then you won't mind if we take a look." Marcus remained still. "Unless you have a warrant or probable cause, I do mind," the crowd murmured. Someone whispered, "He knows his rights." Carter's jaw tightened. His authority was being questioned, and he hated it. Marcus could see it, the shift from ego to aggression. Carter turned toward the second officer. "Davis, call it in. We're searching the vehicle." Davis hesitated. "You sure?" Carter shot him a glare. The message was clear. Fall in line. Marcus exhaled slowly. This was the moment. Comply or stand his ground. Either way, Carter would escalate. The crowd was bigger now, phones up, eyes locked on the scene unfolding. Marcus glanced around. The situation had shifted. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the message this moment would send. Then he made his decision. He reached for the door handle, slowly, deliberately, and stepped out. Carter's hand went straight to his holster. The crowd gasped. A woman screamed, "Oh my God!" Marcus froze, hands up, non-threatening, controlled. Carter smirked. "Turn around, hands on the truck." Marcus clenched his jaw. This wasn't just a power move anymore. It was a trap. The second officer hesitated. He shifted, glancing between Carter and Marcus. "Sir, he's not resisting," Davis muttered. Carter ignored him. His fingers twitched near his weapon. Marcus kept his voice steady. "Is this how you protect and serve?" Carter's expression darkened. The crowd had grown larger, whispers turning into angry murmurs. Marcus could feel the tension reaching a boiling point. One wrong move, and this could turn deadly. And then, it did. Marcus stood still. Hands up. No sudden movements. No threats. But it didn't matter. Carter's hand hovered over his holster, fingers twitching. His pride was bruised, his authority questioned, and men like him hated that. The air was thick with tension. The crowd had grown larger, their voices louder. Phones were recording, but would that be enough? Carter took a step forward. "Turn around, hands on the truck." Marcus hesitated, not in defiance, in calculation. He'd complied with every order. He had done nothing wrong. Yet Carter's eyes burned with something reckless, something dangerous. The second officer, Davis, shifted uneasily. "Carter, maybe we should—" "Stay out of this," Carter snapped. Marcus exhaled through his nose, muscles coiled. A lifetime of discipline kept his emotions in check. Slowly he turned. placed his hands flat against the hood of his truck. Carter moved behind him, heavy boots on pavement, the distinct sound of a holster unsnapping. Marcus tensed. He knew that sound. "Spread your legs," Carter ordered. Marcus didn't move. Something in his gut screamed danger. "You're making this harder than it has to be," Carter growled. "Just do what you're told." Marcus glanced at the crowd, at the dozens of eyes watching, some horrified, some furious, all powerless. "I've done everything you asked," Marcus said, voice calm. "Why is your hand on your gun?" Carter flinched. The question struck a nerve, a challenge he wasn't prepared for. "You think you're smart?" Carter snapped. "Think you can mouth off?" Marcus tightened his jaw. "I think I have rights." Carter's patience snapped. His control slipped. In an instant, he grabbed Marcus's shoulder, yanking him back. The movement was rough, too rough. Marcus stumbled, just a slight shift of balance. But Carter saw what he wanted to see: a threat, a reason, an excuse. His hand flew to his weapon. The gun cleared the holster. The crowd screamed. Bang! The shot rang through the air, sharp and final. Marcus staggered. A fiery pain exploded in his shoulder. His knees buckled. The world tilted. He hit the pavement, breath ragged. Chaos erupted. People shouted. Someone cried out, "He shot him!" The second officer froze, his face drained of color. "Carter, what the hell did you do?" Carter just stood there, gun still raised, his own breath uneven. Marcus blinked against the pain, his vision blurring. This wasn't supposed to happen. His fingers pressed against the wound. Warm blood. Too much of it. The voices around him blurred, fading in and out. He was unarmed. "Recording everything. Call an ambulance." A woman knelt beside him, her hands shaking. "Stay with us, sir. Stay with us." Marcus wanted to answer, to say something, but the pain was a weight dragging him under. Carter finally lowered his weapon. His hands trembled. Reality was sinking in. He had pulled the trigger. The man he had tried to control, to intimidate, lay bleeding on the pavement. Davis took a step back. His face showed it all. Shock, fear, regret. "We need paramedics," someone shouted. Carter still didn't move. The crowd had turned on him. Angry voices, accusing eyes. He was no longer in control. He opened his mouth, but no words came, because there was nothing left to say. Marcus's body felt heavy, his breath shallow, his mind drifted. He had fought for his country, served with honor, and now he was lying on the ground, bleeding, at the hands of the very people sworn to protect. His last thought before everything faded: "I survived war. For this?" Silence. For a moment, everything felt frozen. Then, chaos. Screams, shouts, a rush of movement. Someone called 911. Someone else cursed Carter, their voice shaking with rage. Marcus lay on the pavement, struggling to breathe. His vision blurred, the world tilting. The pain was sharp, relentless. His shoulder burned. A woman knelt beside him, pressing down on the wound. "Stay with us," she whispered, voice cracking. "Help is coming." Marcus forced his eyes open. The sky above him seemed distant, unreal. His own blood was warm against the pavement. His ears buzzed, catching fragments of voices around him. "He shot an unarmed man. For no reason. Just gunned him down. I got it all on camera." The crowd had turned into a wall of outrage. A storm was brewing. Carter stood stiffly, gun still in hand, his face pale. He looked like a man waking up inside his own nightmare. Davis took a step back, shaking his head. "Carter, what the hell did you do?" Carter swallowed hard. He moved too fast." "Too fast?" Davis's voice cracked. He gestured at Marcus. "He's a 60-year-old man." The weight of what had happened was sinking in. Too late. Sirens wailed in the distance. Blue and red lights flickered against the buildings. The paramedics arrived first, pushing through the crowd. "Move back!" one of them shouted, dropping to Marcus's side. Hands pressed firm against his wound, checking vitals. Marcus barely registered the movement. He tried to speak, but his voice came out weak. "I served this country. For this?" The paramedic's hands hesitated for just a second. The words cut through the noise like a blade. Another officer arrived. Not in a squad car, but in an unmarked vehicle. Someone higher up, a superior. His expression darkened the second he saw Marcus on the ground. "What happened?" he demanded. Davis pointed at Carter. "He shot him. No reason. No threat. Just fired." The superior's face turned stone cold. "Body cam footage?" Davis exhaled sharply. Carter delayed turning it on. The officer's jaw clenched. The weight of that single statement was immense. Carter finally seemed to snap out of his shock. "Wait, The superior didn't let him finish. "Hand me your badge, now." Carter's breath hitched. "Sir, now." The crowd erupted into cheers. Justice, or at least the first step toward it. Social media was already ablaze. The videos, the pictures, the outrage. It was all spreading faster than the department could control. Marcus fought to stay conscious as they loaded him onto the stretcher. His body was weak, but his mind was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. It never had been. The city was on fire. Not with flames, but with outrage. The shooting of Marcus Reynolds wasn't just another case. It was a spark, a catalyst, a breaking point. News stations played the footage on repeat. An unarmed veteran, a decorated soldier, shot in broad daylight. The public wanted answers. They wanted justice, and this time, they weren't letting go. The police department scrambled. Statements were issued, press conferences held, but the damage was done. Trust was broken, and no empty words could fix it. Then came the demand, the body cam footage. At first, the department delayed its release, said it was under review, said they needed proper procedures. No one believed them. Activists, journalists, lawyers, everyone was watching, waiting, pushing. Then the truth came out. Carter's body cam had been turned on, but late. The audio captured his words, his tone, his smirk before everything went wrong. It was damning. But it wasn't just the footage that made headlines. Marcus's name carried weight. His military records surfaced. His medals, his years of service, his sacrifices. This wasn't just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He was a hero, and he had been treated like a criminal. The district attorney stepped in, announced an official investigation. Carter was placed on unpaid leave. Davis, too, for failing to intervene. But it didn't stop there. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. Carter had a history, complaints filed, incidents swept under the rug. This wasn't his first time abusing power, just the first time the world was watching. The police union tried to defend him, spoke about split-second decisions, claimed it was a tragic misunderstanding. No one was buying it. Protests grew, signs filled the streets. Justice for Marcus. How many more? This stops now. Marcus, still recovering in the hospital, watched the coverage from his bed. His shoulder ached. His body was weak, but his mind was clear. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who never got justice, every name that wasn't caught on camera. The fight was bigger than one bullet, bigger than one officer. Marcus clenched his jaw. He had spent his life serving this country. Now he would fight to fix it. Marcus sat in his hospital bed staring at the ceiling. His shoulder throbbed, a dull reminder of how close he had come to death. He had survived wars, seen friends fall on foreign soil, but he never thought the battle would follow him home. The news played on the small TV in his room. Protests filled the streets. People marched with signs reading, "Justice for Marcus. Stop the violence." How many more? He turned the volume down. He didn't need to hear the outrage. He felt it in his bones. A knock on the door. "Come in." A woman stepped inside. Sharp suit, determined eyes. She moved like someone who didn't waste time. "Mr. Reynolds, I'm Lisa Carter, civil rights attorney." Marcus studied her. "Carter?" She smirked. "No relation to the officer who shot you." Marcus nodded. "Then what do you want?" Lisa placed a thick folder on his bedside table. "Justice, and I think you do too." He glanced at the documents. Legal papers, case files, a fight in the making. "Your case could set a precedent," she continued. "You're not just any man. You're a veteran, a decorated officer. They shot you in broad daylight with cameras rolling, and still they tried to justify it." Marcus exhaled. "You think we can win?" Lisa held his gaze. I think we have to. He looked down at his hands. Strong, scarred, hands that had fought for this country, and now they would fight again. The next morning he signed the papers. The lawsuit was official. By noon the police department was in full damage control. Press statements, internal investigations. The mayor called for reform. The chief of police promised accountability. None of it mattered. The people weren't backing down. Protests grew larger. Veterans spoke out. Civil rights groups demanded action. Marcus, still recovering, watched it all unfold. But he wasn't just an observer. He was the reason it was happening. Lisa walked into his room, phone in hand. You ready to talk to the press? Marcus smirked. I was born ready. That evening, he sat in front of a camera, his arm in a sling. The world was watching, waiting. I fought for this country, he said, voice steady. I served with honor. But none of that mattered when I was pulled over. None of that mattered when I was shot. The room was silent. No interruptions. No excuses. This isn't just about me, Marcus continued. It's about the names we don't hear, the faces we don't see. It's about a system that needs to change. He looked straight into the lens. And I won't stop until it does. The interview aired nationwide. It wasn't just news, it was a movement, and Marcus was leading it. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, veterans. The whole nation was watching. Carter sat at the defense table, stiff, his jaw clenched. His lawyer whispered something, but Carter barely nodded. He looked smaller than before. Marcus sat across from him. His shoulders still ached, but he sat tall. He had faced worse than this. The judge entered. The room fell silent. This court is now in session. The prosecution began. They played the footage. The gasps in the room were loud, even though the world had already seen it. The smirk on Carter's face, the power trip, the gun clearing the holster, the single unnecessary shot. The prosecutor didn't need to say much. The video spoke louder than any argument. Then came the testimony, the witnesses, the bystanders who saw it all, the paramedics who found Marcus bleeding on the pavement, and then Davis. The second officer sat on the stand, eyes low, hands clasped. Did Officer Carter have any reason to fire his weapon? The prosecutor asked. Davis hesitated. His loyalty, his career, everything was on the line. Then he sighed. No. The courtroom buzzed. Even the defense looked shaken. The cross-examination was brutal. The defense tried to twist the narrative. Split-second decision. Officer safety. A misunderstanding. But no one was buying it. Then it was Marcus's turn. He stood steady, strong, unshaken. He told them everything. The diner, the stairs, the bogus accusations. The moment Carter pulled the trigger, his voice didn't waver. His words didn't falter. I've been in war zones, he said. I've stared down real threats. And I can tell you without a doubt that Officer Carter saw no threat, just an opportunity. Silence. Heavy, unmovable. The defense shifted. Carter clenched his jaw. They knew they were losing. The trial lasted a week. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Then they returned. The room held its breath. The judge looked at the paper. Then her voice rang out, clear and final. Guilty. A pause, a beat of silence. Then the eruption. Some cheered. Some wept. Carter slumped forward, his hands trembling. Marcus just closed his eyes. It was over. Almost. The judge continued. Officer Carter, you are convicted of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and misconduct. Sentencing will take place in 3 days. Carter's lawyer whispered furiously in his ear, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. As the bailiffs led Carter away, he turned toward Marcus. His expression was unreadable. Rage, regret, fear, all tangled together. Marcus didn't react. He had nothing left to say to him. Reporters flooded outside, shoving microphones toward Lisa Carter as she exited with Marcus. Mr. Reynolds, how do you feel? Marcus exhaled. Like justice finally caught up. The cameras flashed. Headlines would follow. But Marcus knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who never got their day in court. And the fight wasn't over yet. The courtroom was silent, tense, waiting. The jury had reached a decision. Now the world would hear it. Marcus sat still, his hands resting on his lap. His shoulder ached, but his mind was clear. This moment was bigger than pain. Carter sat at the defense table, eyes darting between his lawyer and the jury box. He looked different now, smaller, powerless. The judge entered. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." Everyone stood. Then the words everyone had been waiting for. "Jury, have you reached a verdict?" A woman in the front row stood, holding a small sheet of paper. She cleared her throat. "We have, Your Honor." Marcus's heart pounded, but he kept his face calm. The judge nodded. "What is your decision?" The juror inhaled sharply, then spoke. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Brian Carter, guilty on all charges." A gasp rippled through the room, then a wave of emotion. Tears, cheers, relief. Carter slumped forward, his hands trembling. His lawyer whispered frantically, but it was over. The judge's voice cut through the noise. "Sentencing will be carried out immediately." Marcus sat straighter. The final moment was here. The judge's tone was firm. "Officer Carter, you have been found guilty of aggravated assault and misconduct. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in prison." Carter's face went pale. Reality had caught up with him. The bailiff stepped forward. Handcuffs clicked around Carter's wrists. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He had nothing left to say. As he was led away, his eyes met Marcus's. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't look away. Carter was just another man now, stripped of power, stripped of control. Justice had spoken. Outside, reporters swarmed Marcus, microphones shoved toward his face. "Mr. Reynolds, how do you feel?" Marcus exhaled. Like justice finally caught up. The cameras flashed, headlines would follow. But Marcus knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who never got their day in court. And the fight wasn't over yet. The fight was over, but the movement had just begun. Marcus sat at his usual diner booth, a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. The place was quieter than usual. The weight of everything still lingered. The trial was over. The sentence had been handed down. Justice had been served. But Marcus knew justice wasn't a single moment. It was a battle fought every day. A young waiter approached, placing a fresh plate of eggs in front of him. He hesitated, then spoke. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you." Marcus looked up. The kid's hands trembled slightly, but his eyes held something strong. "Hope." Marcus nodded. "For what?" The waiter swallowed. "For standing up, for not letting them silence you. You gave a lot of people hope." Marcus let the words settle. Hope. That was the real victory. He reached for his coffee, taking a slow sip. The same diner, the same routine. But nothing felt the same anymore. Outside, the world had changed. The protests had led to reform discussions. The police department was under intense scrutiny. People were paying attention. Marcus wasn't just a veteran anymore. He had become a symbol. He glanced at the headlines on a nearby newspaper. His name was everywhere. But this wasn't about him. It was about every person who had ever been silenced. And he wasn't done yet. Because some legacies don't fade. They ignite change.